Thank you for joining our April informational webinar, Behavior is Communication, Addressing Problem Behaviors as a Gateway to Success. My name is Drew Andrews. I am the Assistant Director and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities at the University of Central Florida. This webinar is being recorded, and the webinar will be uploaded to YouTube, and that link will be sent to you along with a link to complete the evaluation if you don't have time at the end of this webinar to complete the evaluation. Our presenter today is Erica Myler from the UMatter program at the University of South Florida. Erica is a former special educator and current board certified behavior analyst. She is a doctoral student at the University of South Florida. She also serves as mentor coordinator for the UMatter program at USF. She earned a bachelor's degree in special education from Lee University, and a master's in teaching as applied behavior analysis from the Teacher College at Columbia University. During the past decade in the field, she has worked in educational, community, and clinical settings, which has only increased her passion for developing effective educators to serve diverse populations. Her research interests include the intersection of behavior analysis and education, teacher inquiry, and the role of empathy in effective practice. Handouts can be downloaded from the chat section, which can be accessed by clicking on the chat icon or the small speech bubble at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you are having difficulty hearing the presentation, phone numbers that can be used to call and join the audio via phone while following the slides online will also be posted in the chat window. Additionally, closed captioning can be accessed in the bottom of the Zoom screen under live captioning. At this time, we will begin our webinar. Erica?
All right, I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, well, throughout this session, I'm just gonna welcome some engagement through the use of Mentimeter. So if you have your cell phones handy, please scan the QR code and give a little bit of feedback as far as what you're hoping to get out of this session. And then there will be several opportunities along our journey today for you to give continued input and just some more information so I can kind of tailor this to serve you better. So feel free to scan that and we'll take a look at the results. A couple more moments and then we'll move on. But yes, definitely the purpose of today is to give you all some information and ideas, definitely interventions and strategies. And I do really hope both you are empowered and then you can go and empower your students by implementing some things that you gather today. So we'll go ahead and move on. But again, so excited to be here and talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, behavior. So the title of this is Behavior is Communication, Addressing Problem Behaviors as a Gateway to Success. So my goal here is to really help provide a framework and maybe a new perspective as to how to approach behaviors. I know we're not going to have all the solutions at the end of this, but hopefully giving you some information that gives you a framework to kind of individualize behavior intervention strategies, things within your program. And I'll definitely be giving some individual strategies that hopefully you'll be able to apply. And also we'll be looking at what some of the research says specifically in this setting. So again, Drew was kind enough to kind of give the overview as to my background, but most of it is that intersection of behavior analysis and education. And then I've had the joy of being with UMatter for about a year now and getting to see how programs like all of the ones we're in really empower our students to be successful adults. So that has been great. So our objectives today are to first be able to identify the functions of behavior, looking at why are behaviors happening, and when we know why they might be happening, being able to then identify strategies and the appropriate intervention based on that, and then also what skills might be missing that we need to teach our students, and then also just being able to identify a few action steps that you might be able to implement when you go back to your programs even this next week, and how you might do that collaborating with other professionals, other people in your university community, because I think that's really, really important in all settings, but I think especially in ours. So this is just a little overview of what we'll be going through. Talking about behavior as communication, what it tells us, looking at the functions and ABCs as to why things are happening, interventions and strategies, and then just some other considerations, since I think our setting and the environment we work in is a little bit unique. So again, if you would give some of your input as to when you hear all behavior is communication, kind of what comes to mind and what that might mean to you. Right. I see a lot of great answers. Expressing our inner thoughts through our behaviors, behaviors being communicating what we're thinking or what's going on inside. Also the why, that's exactly right. Self-advocacy. Yes. Awesome. Awesome. And so this kind of aligns with kind of the direction we'll be going today, is looking at behavior and what our students do, their actions, as telling us maybe what we might need to change in our approach as to what we're doing, maybe things that in the environment need to change, or it's communicating a need that they have, a skill deficit that they have, and you really framing it that way instead of just, this is a problem, get rid of it, but really using it to help us and help the student make changes and decide what direction we're going to go through. So again, what is behavior anyway? So this graphic kind of aligns with that behavior. It's communication. There's the behavior and then there's everything that's under it. But really, a behavior is anything that a person says or does. It's how they interact with their environment. And so we think a lot about those overt behaviors, those things that we can observe, such as eating or running, different actions we might observe, but there's also those covert behaviors, which are usually those overt behaviors are an expression of. So covert would be frustrated or sad or things like that. So that those overt behaviors being what we can observe and kind of address more succinctly. So we'll talk a little bit about why this is important. Why are we even bothering to talk about this today? And I know that we talk about it a lot in our program, just about things that are barriers when our students come to us or along the way that if they're not addressed can cause them to have to leave the program. And so that's one reason it's important is increasing that access and the opportunities to learn skills that they come to us lacking. I know that just even this past year, I've tried to delve into what research is there out there about behavior interventions, behavior analysis in this setting, and there's not a ton. There's a couple studies that we'll discuss today, but there's not a lot to gather from. And so today I'll be providing some general research-based strategies, but we're seeing what works. And so again, Taub in 2017 stated appropriate supports for our students include both individual and natural supports. So that'll be one focus, is using those appropriate and natural supports within that we already use in our environment to support our students. Just to give you an overview as we continue along with kind of the basics of behavior and the perspective that I'll be presenting, behavior analysis really focuses on socially significant behaviors, which I really think is what we want to address anyway in our programs, is those behaviors that are limiting independence, limiting access to social environments, and inhibiting them from being successful. Antecedent manipulations, we'll talk about these a little later, but what changes in the environment before behaviors happen can we make so that it's not all when it's happening, but how can we prevent the behavior? Positive reinforcement, this is huge. We want to reinforce the behaviors we want to happen more. And sometimes we end up, without knowing it, reinforcing behaviors that we don't want, and thus they escalate. So that's huge in behavior analysis. We focus on the fact that behavior is learned and it can change, which is wonderful, and that those behaviors happen for a reason, and also that private events are behavior. That is acknowledged in the field now, that there are things that happen in our brains and inside us that we might not be able to observe, but those are behavior too and can be addressed. So the basics when we're looking at behavior, the whys, we really get down to 4 functions of behavior. So behaviors might happen for sensory reasons, so needing that sensory input or being overstimulated. They may happen for escape. They don't want to do their work. You don't want a certain task or a certain environment. Attention. So some behaviors happen because a student, a child, an adult wants attention, and tangibles, access to preferred items and those concrete things. So these can happen for students with disabilities. They can happen for typically developing adults. Behavior is behavior. So these are kind of the 4 that we focus in on. And so you'll want to remember these as we move forward. So as we look at these are just a few examples of behaviors as their function. So sensory might be rocking a lot. It might be some scripting, some humming, different movements, different things they want to touch or taste, escape. So leaving a classroom, or maybe not even going to the class at first, because they want to escape that work. Attention. So a lot of kids are going to scream or throw a tantrum because they want attention from the people around them. And then tangibles, sometimes you'll see the same behavior, but it has a different function. So child may still throw a tantrum, but it's because they want access to a toy they want. So it's really looking at, it might be the same behavior, that two students might emit the same behavior, but it might have a different reason. So when we're looking at the function to kind of figure it out, we want to think about the antecedent. So what happened right before the behavior occurred? What was the observable action? What actually occurred? What did the student, the child, do? And then what happened after? Sometimes you'll be able to figure out the function easy if you see that it's by looking at the consequence as well. If a student screams and calls out in class and they get their teacher's attention, then they're getting what they want. They're getting that attention, but so that's maintaining that behavior. So we'll look more in a moment at how you can change those things around to still get that child that need of attention, but through an appropriate way. So we'll just do a quick little quiz on the functions of behavior before we move on. So you can scan that and go through really quick and take the quiz. So yeah, what might the function of a student scripting be? And some of these there might not be an exact right answer. Some of them, the majority might be a certain answer might seem more straightforward, but really it could be any of these. A lot of times you will see that scripting is a sensory need. It's self-soothing a lot of our students. And I know we've kind of worked with one of our students on that, just because sometimes they're scripting because they're calming themselves down. They might be in an overstimulating environment and people might hear what they're scripting and it sound inappropriate. So kind of teaching those self-monitoring skills. But great job on that one. And then we'll go. So what might the function of a student frequently going to the bathroom during work time be? Yes, escape. That one seems pretty obvious. And then a student's told no when they ask to have access to a favorite activity and they begin yelling and screaming. What is the function? Yeah, I think in some instances it definitely could be attention seeking, but having that access to a certain item would usually qualify as tangible or access to a tangible. And last one. Yeah, so a student frequently lies and embellishes stories when talking with peers. Might the function be? Yes, attention. You know, you see it in adults too, like on social media, people who are giving tons of comments and saying outlandish things, or friends that gossip and are dramatic about things. Usually it's attention seeking. So that's great. We will move on. So again, when we know the function, then we can use that to determine what we're going to do about it, what that intervention is going to be. So we're going to look at antecedent strategies. So what strategies can we put in place that happen consistently to decrease the probability that the behavior is going to occur? So that might be having a written schedule for the student so they know what is expected of them or what is going to happen, or just increasing opportunities for positive reinforcement in the environment. There's lots of different little things that we'll look at a little later that can be done to even reduce the chances that it's going to happen. Then we think about, okay, why is this skill happening? What skills do we need to teach to replace that behavior? Because we're not just going to be able to get rid of it. We need to teach something to replace that so they can still get access to that function, to that tangible, to that to escape appropriately, to the sensory input they need, whatever it is. And then what contingencies do we need to put in place? What is the reinforcement going to be? And that might be some naturally occurring things in the environment. It might be some access to privileges that they get when they are emitting those appropriate behaviors. It could just be some social interaction. You can get really creative with these things, especially depending on the student and what they need and what functions as that positive reinforcement. It's not going to be the same for everyone, but we want to look at these three components when we're thinking about interventions. So again, when we talked a little bit about antecedent manipulations, now when you're thinking about a target behavior and then the skill that you're going to teach, those replacement skills, these are just a few examples of how you might correlate those replacement behaviors. So a student's talking out a lot in class, they're wanting that attention. So you're going to teach some appropriate way for them to gain attention. Perhaps they're emitting some yelling, some aggression in the residential halls when they're really upset. Maybe because they didn't have access, maybe because of some other issue, but teaching some self-regulation skills, teaching them to take a break prior to when they're escalated. Those are the type of skills you might look at there. Sometimes there's that aggression because they want access to, you'll see it, you know, in kids or even sometimes in adults, who knows, hitting because to get access to something. And so instead teaching that functional communication, teaching how to ask for what you need, instead of this other behavior. And then another example might be just a student's consistently skipping class. What are you going to do instead? It might be because they're escaping the work. It's too hard. It's too overwhelming. And so you'd want to look at modifying assignments that they can access. And then this is just to gather a little bit of feedback before we move on here from you guys as far as what behaviors have concerned you all most in your program. I have some perspective just from mine, but interested to see what y'all say. I don't know why it's not showing the responses, so we might have to go back to this. So I'll go ahead and move on. So now that we've kind of talked about identifying the function, identifying the replacements, skills, and contingencies, that all the aspects that we need to address, these are just some general things to consider when you're developing those behavioral supports. Not only do they need to be individualized, but really taking into consideration a person's culture, and those any other diversities or things that they bring to the table that might need to be considered when we're looking at what's most appropriate and what's going to help them be successful. Looking at the environmental changes to make, a lot of times it's not just the student's behavior that we need to change, but we need to change things in the environment. A lot of times our own actions and helping us change our perspective before anything else. We want to stay positive, looking especially at what we want the student to do. Sometimes we get really caught up in the negative or what they're not able to do or that negative thing that they are doing. And we have to be contingent on it and hold a high standard while remaining very positive and stating positive expectations. Focusing on social integration, which I think is one of the strengths of our programs, is we really do focus on that inclusive aspect, allowing choice and autonomy. Again, this is huge with our population since they are adults, and emphasize the learning that needs to be done to help target those problem behaviors.
Erica, I put in the chat box the responses.
Okay.
Okay, so just so you can see that and everyone
Okay,
can see
great.
what the responses were for that last question.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Iris. All right. So let me get rid of. So one of the major aspects of behavioral supports that I try and address at every level that I've worked at is staff training, because it's not going to help if just one person is implementing certain strategies or helping intervene with a behavior. You want that consistency across all the stakeholders. So looking at who is working with the student. This could be mentors, this could be professors, program staff, other natural supports within the university setting. I know our accessibility center, our tutoring center, those are other settings that we look at collaborating with, just so that the student is being held to those expectations, as well as those strategies are being used with anyone working with the student. We're going to go into this a little more in a moment, especially focusing on those peer mentors, because that's where we've seen a lot of the good research in this setting as far as implementing behavioral interventions. So in the first study that we'll look at, it is by Lancey et al. And they conducted this study in an inclusive post-secondary program, and they had 3 peer mentor-student pairs, and they had different behavior intervention plans for each of those pairs. And they were looking really at being able to give feedback and how effective giving that performance feedback and checking fidelity was in peer mentors being effective using strategies for behaviors. And so each mentor was trained in it. They did require multiple coaching sessions. That's the results indicated that they needed the initial training, which gave them that first overview of the intervention plan, but they needed those multiple coaching sessions following it with some performance feedback, that observing the mentor and then giving feedback about their implementation after, in order for them to do things with fidelity. But the great thing is with those 2 follow-up sessions of coaching, they did see that those problem behaviors decreased and those pro-social appropriate behaviors increased following these trainings. And so really, this could happen with individual students, but even looking at providing training and follow-up training for our mentors as far as certain key behavioral strategies, whether that be positive reinforcement, those antecedent manipulations that we'll talk about a little more, to help them be successful. And this next study got even a little more specific than the last. They focused on one pair, a mentor and a student, and the student was emitting a lot of escape behaviors. So refusal, cursing, yelling, some aggression, calling 911 at inappropriate times, a whole slew of things to get out of work or homework when they were working with the mentor or during transition to a non-preferred activity. So they identified the 3 settings that the student was emitting these behaviors most in. And then they conducted assessments and some observations with the student to really gather information as to why the behavior was occurring. And they identified that it was for escape. So the main behavior was all of these things that were off-task behavior. And so they wanted to replace it with on-task behavior. So they defined those very clearly and succinctly within the paper, and then conducted trainings with the peer mentors on the behavior plan, on how to reinforce the student for appropriate behaviors, on certain environmental conditions like a visual schedule, choices, providing choices throughout tasks and settings, and giving systematic breaks and modifying assignments. These little things, changing these little things, and then providing a lot of positive reinforcement when they were on task, and ignoring those off-task behaviors and redirecting to what they wanted them to do. So they trained, gave feedback in all the settings, and both the behavior, the appropriate behavior for the student increased, and also the mentor's ability to implement this with fidelity also increased across settings, so that she was able to be effective, not just with her mentee in one setting, but across different settings and different mentees. So with this, I also can't not talk about data. So when we take data on our behaviors, we want to be really specific as to defining what we're looking at, which in that study, they were really good about defining exactly what off-task behaviors were and what on-task behaviors were. And you can take data on how many times something happens, how long it happens, if it occurs during certain time intervals. It's really going to depend on what the behavior is, how often it's happening, which you might choose. But we want to take it so that we know if what we're doing is working or if we need to change something again. So there's quite a few ways you can collect data. I know I've had a lot of success with Microsoft or Google Forms, just because you could do it on your phone, quickly input some things and submit it, and all stakeholders can use that same form. And I know I have my peer mentors using Google Forms to submit a lot of anecdotal data for me, as well as looking at some self-monitoring data, which we'll talk about some self-monitoring in a moment, and then any staff can collect it. So going back to those antecedent interventions, changing the environment to help the behavior not happen. And a lot of them are simple things you can do. Integrating interests, increasing opportunities for choice, depending on what the behavior is, you're going to kind of look at what little things might prevent it from happening. We're going to go back to reinforcement again, just because we want to reinforce what we want to happen. And some of that, and we'll look at some of these strategies in a moment. Some of it might just be access to certain privileges in the environment, making it as natural as possible, not having to have to contrive as much reinforcement. Looking at group contingencies, peer pressure is quite powerful if you use it in the right way. Giving responsibilities and also working with families closely as to what might reinforce the student in the correct behaviors. So the first strategy to look at that really is something you can use for a lot of different things is behavior contracts. And it's also great because it really mirrors something our students might receive in a work environment, that contract and that statement of expectations. So the contract is going to be between maybe the staff and the individual, or a teacher and professor and that individual, two individuals, and it outlines the target behaviors, the consequences, and the reinforcement for meeting those goals. So this is a nice little graphic that kind of lays out what needs to be in a behavioral contract and kind of the steps. So first, thinking about the behaviors you want to change, defining who are the stakeholders in this contract, meeting with the student and deciding upon those positive expected behaviors. We're really focusing on those replacement skills, those what you're wanting them to do. And the reinforcers. So, and also the expectations and criteria. So making it as specific as possible, as they need to make it to class 100% of classes, or as specific as possible as to what you want them to do. And then having those time goals as to when that needs to be met or how long that needs to be met, and monitoring and reviewing progress on that. So these are just some do's and don'ts when you're using this. It's, again, describing what the students should do. It's not necessarily describing all those problem behaviors. It might define like what's going on and what they're going to replace it with, and then what the reinforcement is. Really stating them as goals, empowering our students that these are goals they want to meet, and what they get as an outcome of it. And using it as a tool to remind the students, pre-correct and prompt those appropriate behaviors. These are just a couple of examples of behavior contracts, just to show that you can really personalize it, make it as individualized as you need to for our students. This is another one that included a student assessment and a teacher assessment, and kind of used a rubric scoring system. And then this one is one we actually implemented with one of our students. There were some behaviors occurring in his internship work environment. And so we wrote up this internship contract about what behaviors he needed to change, what needed to happen instead, and what he could do to achieve that behavior. And as a result of it, by omitting those appropriate behaviors, he gets the privilege of staying in his internship, which was a really powerful reinforcer for him. So some of these I deleted just to keep it blank and give you an example, but he was eating some of the condiments in the line at the restaurant. And the expected behavior was to not eat the condiments or to not eat while he was on his duty. And so one of the steps and interventions used was wearing gloves, but I also suggested just that it could be a sensory thing to have him maybe chewing gum or have a mint in his mouth instead, to kind of have that be a behavior that he's not going to put the condiments in with the mint. And so this is another example of just laying out explicitly and having the student and the staff sign the agreement. Another great intervention, especially because we're wanting our students to eventually not need us, to be living independently and being able to monitor and regulate themselves. So again, this is key in self-determination, which is one of those big predictors in our student success post-program. So using teaching self-monitoring, and it might be in a more systematic way, which I'll show in a moment, to increase their awareness as to their behavior, and also increase or decrease what behaviors you want. So you might give them a form like this to use and have certain criteria, and then they can rate themselves. It might be certain behaviors you want them to engage in during class, and they monitor themselves. Did I do this? Or it might be counting the frequency of a behavior, like did I talk out in class, or did I raise my hand in class? And those are just some simple examples, but these are great forms to kind of teach that self-monitoring, which you might want to do to kind of train the student, like during some times with them, or have a mentor help train the student in filling these out, and then kind of fade out that support and have them return them to you and see how that awareness and how those behaviors have changed. Again, a lot of our students need those independent skills of regulating themselves. So a lot of these replacement skills, we have to teach them explicitly. They're not just going to learn through osmosis, or if we just tell them do this instead. We may need to take time to teach these things explicitly, whether it be self-regulation, or whether it be communication or time management. Whatever strategies that we need them to do instead might need to be taught explicitly, and taught at a time where they're not escalated, where it's calm, and they can really learn the skills so that they can apply it when it needs to be applied. So I know we do this a lot in a lot of our workshops with our students. We take time to teach them breathing techniques, calming exercises, the ability to ask for breaks when they need it, and incorporating these things regularly, modeling them regularly as those replacement skills. This is, again, huge, the collaboration. So I know our students a lot of times come to us with 20 years of instructional history, 20 years of maybe behaviors being reinforced, behaviors being learned, And so it truly does take collaboration and probably quite a bit of time to address these behaviors. They might be skills that they've never been taught. And so really looking at what are the resources in the community, in the university, on campus, or within the students' community who can really help their progress. So I know we've seen a lot of need for those mental health services. That's where a lot of support I think we've observed in our program have been needed in order to support those appropriate behaviors, collaborating with VR, ABA providers in the community, as well as medical providers, family members, mentors, and friends. It really does take a village and everyone's expertise to really support our students, because sometimes we don't have all the answers, and sometimes it may be we intervene and we provide these behavioral supports and they're still not able to be successful, but we want to be able to provide whatever we can to give them opportunity and access to the opportunity to be successful. So again, just a few other considerations. As I said, their instructional history, so thinking about their however long they had to learn things good and bad before they came to us. So patience is key. Also really thinking about how we can integrate these supports and strategies when we're person-centered planning. I know we've kind of tried to look at that as far as really setting explicit goals in order to connect those to long-term goals. And also consistency is key. I think that is one of the biggest things that I've learned throughout my journey is just consistency. These are my references, and you'll receive the handouts, but this is my email. I'm always happy to chat, schedule a time to chat, brainstorm, things like that, or provide some of these articles or links and such, because it's been kind of a fast overview of some things. And I know that everyone probably has a lot going on. So I'm happy to take some time if you need anything. But other than that, I appreciate everyone attending, and yeah, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Erica. Is it okay if we have a little question time, Erica?
Of course, we have a few
Okay.
minutes.
If you would like to, you can unmute yourself and ask verbally, or if you would like to write your question in the chat, our team will be watching the chat box to make sure that we answer the questions. This is a lot of information. You were very thorough, Erica, very.
Yeah, and if anyone thinks of questions later, again, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff and help problem solve. So
Questions, feel free. Well, I do want to remind everyone that there is an evaluation of today's webinar, and that link is in the chat box. And so if you would please.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think there's a question that popped up that says, where can I find those check-in materials? I'm not sure if that's referring to the materials from the webinar itself or.
it might be those self-monitoring the behavior sheets. If you send me an email, I am happy to send you the documents.
It's the behavior sheets they're saying.
Right.
Self-monitoring, yes.
Self-monitoring, yes.
Thank you, Drexler. Thank you for letting me know that. Any other questions? Lots of positive feedback in the chat window, I will say that. I would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email that contains a link to the recording to this webinar, as well as the handout materials and a link to the evaluation. Again, the evaluation is in the chat box, and Iris Neal is sharing that. And so if you just find Iris's name, you'll see the evaluation. And we do want your feedback and suggestions for future webinars. And I would like to also let you know that our next webinar will be May 7th. And the topic will be strategies for providing mental health supports to students with intellectual disabilities in Florida post-secondary comprehensive transition programs. And Dr. Nicole Atong with the FIU Embrace program will be our presenter. And registration information can be found on our website, which is fcsua.org. And you can register there. I want to thank everyone for joining, and especially our presenter, Erica. What a wonderful job. Thank you so much. What a very thorough presentation, and also the resources and the strategies to really give us something that we can take away and put into action right away. Thank you so much.